Nothing has been kept more secret from Americans than the actual destruction wrought upon Ukraine and its people. The nation, which numbered 52 million in 1991 when it became an independent state, is now down to something like the population of the Netherlands or Taiwan, around 20 million people. That is appalling. It has the lowest birth rate in the world.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in a cellar. It's moderate outside. Londinium is dark at this time of year. We're coming into a new year, and we're enjoying our cup of wine and philosophizing about the 21st century and our own first century AD. However, the attention must go to the promise of the new year with the new emperor in Washington, Mr. Trump, and an offer from the warlord of Eurasia. That would be Vladimir Putin. The quote we're given from the news in translation, Mr. Putin said in an annual press conference, "I have not talked to him, Mr. Trump, for more than 4 years. Of course, I'm ready to talk anytime. I will be ready to meet with him if he wishes." A response from Mr. Trump is equally promising. President Putin said that he wants to meet with me as soon as possible, Trump said during remarks at a convention several days past. So we have to wait for this, but we have to end that war. That war is horrible, horrible, referring to the Ukrainian war. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. We've recently speculated about how Alexander I and Napoleon could have worked out their dispute and not led to a continental crack-up. However, right now, it appears that Mr. Putin is in a mood to talk to Mr. Trump. Is that a positive development? And how do you see Mr. Trump handling this offer by the warlord of Eurasia? Good evening to you.
Good evening, Gaius. It is most certainly positive, and it is quite clear that Russia is eager to end the conflict, but it can't it can't retreat or compromise on a couple of things. And when Mr. Putin talks about accommodation, he's earnest and sincere, but I'm not sure that Mr. Trump understands the actual picture. And the real problem, the real snare, the real tar baby for Trump is that he must avoid the trap being set for him by the European and American imperial establishments who still want the war to continue and who are still vested in the war and will do anything to suck Mr. Trump into continuing it. And the real problem that they pose to Mr. Trump is a kind of media apprehension problem, in the sense that once he takes office, he will own the war. And thus, if he, like Richard Nixon in 1968, comes into office with a promise to end the war and is unable to do so, then blue, the Democrats, can do exactly what they did in 1969 and after, which is to take a war that they had created and pursued, that they had made a giant debacle for the United States, and then say, oh, this is Nixon's war. This is the war that he is leading, that he is taking and, away into the future. He is the cause of all these Americans dying. And therefore, he owns it. Now, this is something that Mr. Trump has to, at all costs, avoid. And yet there is a simple way for him to turn things around. It's not pleasant, but it's part of the kind of hardscrabble politics that we are now totally used to in the United States. Namely, what he has to do is to show how the pursuit of a venal and narcissistic war on the part of the Biden administration to bring down Russia has resulted in the absolute destruction of Ukraine. And for the first time, what he can do, he can reveal a lot of things in a lot of areas, as he's promised to do, such as the JFK dossier, everything that has been kept secret. Nothing has been kept more secret from Americans than the actual destruction wrought upon Ukraine and its people. The nation, which numbered 52 million in 1991 when it became an independent state, is now down to something like the population of the Netherlands or Taiwan, of around 20 million people. That is appalling. It has the lowest birth rate in the world. And more than that, the number of men who are now irrecoverable casualties, meaning they're either dead, missing, deserted, prisoners, or they are too incapacitated to ever return to active service. That number is well over 1 million. And there are men approaching 70 in full combat gear dying on the front lines today in Donbass. It's a horror. And the fact is that this war cannot continue simply because it will lead to the absolute forever destruction of Ukraine as a nation, which is supposedly the opposite of what we sought. Now, the fact is that Russia has already won the war. So the hopes of the NATO establishment, the Washington imperial establishment, is to say, well, let's keep the war going. Let's draft men and women down to 18 or maybe younger. Let's just keep pushing it. The fact is that that is no longer a possibility. And any kind of solution, quote unquote, that postpones NATO membership, that creates a ceasefire in place, a la the Korean solution in 1953, would doom Ukraine forever. And for this reason, because even if Russia acceded to a Korea-style solution, none of the millions of Ukrainians who've left the country will ever come back, especially all the men, because they know that a Korea solution will not have the legs in terms of an extended armistice that Korea's had for over 70 years. It will simply result in another war picked up at some point, because the US and NATO will keep rearming Ukraine and pushing it toward war, and no Ukrainian will come back. So we have the prospect, with Ukraine's birth rate and fertility as low as it is, that within a generation, Ukraine will be a nation half the size even of what it is today, a nation no bigger than Belarus, maybe 10 million people. And it'll never be a working nation.
Let me recount Europe on this. Berlin has no government, none. There are elections in February. There'll be a compromise, and Friedrich Merz, the leader of the Christian Democratic Union, is not indicated one way or the other, but he's certainly no hawk. France has a broken government, a temporary prime minister, because they can't hold new elections till next summer by mandate. And Macron is compromised by the rise of National Rally. Britain, Starmer, the prime minister for 5 years, his approval rating keeps plunging. And he's leading an overwhelming majority that has no appetite for war, none whatsoever. In fact, the foreign minister is more hostile to Mr. Trump than he is to Mr. Putin. And then we have the rest of the NATO countries certainly not capable of mounting the kind of offensive power that Germany, France, and Britain could once mount, do not look like hawks to me. Finland's guarding its border, and it's concerned about that cable incident, but it's certainly not ready to take on Russia in a winter war. And that means NATO wants this deal made. Mr. Trump is not an ideologue. He's transactional. Is there an offer that Putin can make him that Trump would find advantageous? We have a couple of minutes.
Yes, that offer is what Russia absolutely needs and um, cannot compromise on, and that is no NATO, no
Right.
Ukraine in NATO forever. Also, demilitarize Ukraine, meaning that we don't start rearming it the moment that there's a ceasefire in effect. And I think basically that is really all that's required. I mean, Putin himself has said it is not necessary to go beyond the four oblasts.
And what's wrong with that, Michael, going beyond the four oblasts? And one of them, by the way, in Novorossiya is Odessa Oblast, which
Right.
right now there are no Russian troops in there, although they have a nice little contingent in Transnistria and have appetite for Moldova. But still, I don't find anything wrong with Russia gobbling up what is essentially a broken nation, half Polish and half Ukrainian. Why should we object to that? It's completely out of the argument about prosperity in Europe, which is profoundly troubled. What is the goal here for the war fighters? I mean, this reminds me of a New Yorker cartoon back in the 20th century. You had a ragtag group looking like Spartacus and his ex-slaves standing there surrounded by several Roman legions. And the remark is, but we have freedom on our side. That's what this reminds me of, Michael. But that was a New Yorker joke, not national policy.
Well, the solution outlined and the one that Mr. Putin would accept is great in the larger context. But as I said earlier, it is absolutely necessary for Mr. Trump to avoid being tarred with the canard that somehow he sacrificed Ukraine and it's his war and he appeased Russia. And the way to do that, as I was trying to say earlier, is to show how screwed up this is and how the only way to save Ukraine is to come to terms with Russia and create a lasting settlement. That if it's not a lasting settlement, there'll be another war. No Ukrainians will return. Ukraine will disappear essentially as a nation. So he can, if he is able to articulate that and say, look, I'm coming in not as a savior, but as a man offering succor for Ukraine. I won't necessarily lift them up, but I'll keep them from being destroyed forever. And he has to be able to articulate that. If
25 years from now, is Ukrainian war as vivid a memory as the Bosnian War of the late 20th century? Is that where it is in 25 years?
the Bosnian War is still electric, it's all over Kosovo and Serbia.
Who remembers it?
The people who live there do. And the whole point is Ukraine does not want. Ukraine is in the position of France in 1918. And France in 1918, for all the fact that it was one of the victors, was a broken nation because it had lost so many people.
I'm convinced. You don't have to convince me anymore. Germanicus, what you've convinced me of is something perhaps you didn't anticipate. Ukraine is not our future.
No. And we must divest ourselves of it. And there is a way to do that without being tarred by some alternative.
All right, but in European terms, they want the deal.
Yes, they do. So I think that I again, the stars are in alignment for Mr. Trump. He just has to not be distracted or leveraged by these establishment types, these imperial war hawks. And that is still a problem. He has some of them in his incoming administration.
You use the Vietnam example. It's a good one, except this. Europe was not involved in Vietnam, not whatsoever. NATO didn't take a position. France was indifferent. In fact, it led the protests of 68, completely
True.
different from anti-war protests.
True.
It was about a cultural change. Europe is intimately involved in the Ukrainian war, and it's cost it money, Michael. And
Oh, The bottom line is he has to do it cleanly. He has to end the war in a way that it won't start up again in 10 years. And he has to
Your
feel
standards are very high, Germanicus.
he has to be courageous enough to do that and not create a situation that will lead to another war. And I think, frankly, given the mood and sentiment of the vast majority of Europeans, they will applaud that.
We agree on that. They're ready to applaud now. The moment Trump walks into the room with Putin, wherever it is,
Yeah.
that's fine. That's enough for Europe to say deal done. They're that tired of it. Is who's standing up for Ukraine outside of the TV channels that show up in Kiev? Who? Who is this person?
You have the European establishment and the American imperial establishment, and they
Albert
have
Schultz
to
is
be
gone.
ignored.
Macron is weakened.
Well,
Starmer's on his down
yes,
after. Oh,
yes, there is.
Giorgia Maloney. There's Ukraine's support, but
Look, look,
she
you can't. It still has to be done, and the fact is that Trump has
I'm
to
agreeing
put
with you. I'm saying it's already done.
well, hopefully that would be wonderful. And then I'll just applaud it when it is done because I'm so sick and tired as is everyone else of watching Ukraine being destroyed for the vanity of the United States.
Therein is a challenge. Was Ukraine a nation to begin with?
No, but it was a place and with real people, and it's always been a place with real people, and we have used them for our own narcissism and allowed them to be sacrificed for nothing. And we need to own up to that. And that's the pathway for Mr. Trump to say enough is enough.
Boy, that's a high bar to blame. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. Gaius and Germanicus Michael Vlahos is here. The centurions and their families have gone home. We're off to the theater later. There's singers in town from Rome or some such. Ostia, actually. I don't think it's Rome. And these are singing hits that are popular back in Rome. We're very far from Rome. In fact, every once in a while I check to make sure we haven't gotten any closer overnight. It's very good to be. I think we're about a week's walk, and that's adequate to keep out the troublemakers who would come up here and look over things in Rome and Britain. Domitian is the emperor. He has displeased the Senate, and his end will be violent. We, however, are staying out of it entirely, looking to the future, a very big future, the 21st century. And the question here is the new emperor, who is a Gracchus-like character, a man who his qualities make him optimates, a senator, but his sympathies and his support makes him populares, the plebes. And he has taken on two lieutenants. One, the adopted son, Vance, a tyro out of Ohio, the Nutmeg State, a Marine, a Yale Law School graduate, a man from humble beginnings, well-spoken, and very young, 40 years old. The other lieutenant is named Musk, born in South Africa, of parents that are complicated, but in any event, Musk has a dream, which is to die on Mars in a colony that he's built. He estimates that he needs to transport about 1 million tons of goods to Mars to sustain the colony, make sure that it can generate its own energy if the supply ships stop coming from Earth. I know it sounds a little odd and science fiction, but that inspires Musk. That's why he's where he is right now, which is counselor to the president. The question is, and Germanicus and I have enjoyed debating this, we have not settled, is Musk, is he Sulla, the dictator? Is he Cataline, the schemer? Is he Mark Antony, the betrayer? What is he? What is the threat he represents? I maintain that one threat is he cannot be elected president of the United States because of that little detail in the Constitution that says you have to be born in the United States or territory possessed by the United States. The other part we know is that he's extremely well-to-do, sometimes introduced as the richest man in the solar system. that means that his road to the White House would be very fraught with class warfare. However, right now he's not showing any indication that he wants to be in the White House. He's got a position advancing his own case at Tesla, that's EVs, at SpaceX, that's off to Mars, and at Twitter, where he has a megaphone that goes around the world. No matter how you deny it, everyone hears Musk. So, Germanicus, have you decided? Have we got a challenge here that's recognizable to us Romans? Sulla, Cataline, Mark Antony, or some other creature?
He is not a Sulla in the sense that he is not the leader of armies that come to rescue and purge the republic of its filth, shall we say, its civic filth. That is actually closer to Mr. Trump. But in some ways, he does resemble, although it's a kind of odd analogy in the sense that, and it has to be because there were no industrialists in the time of the late Roman Republic and the early Empire. However, there were figures that were sometimes close to being equal to the supreme leader. And a good example would be Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, who was the enabler of the creation of the Roman Empire, and really the man that Augustus most relied upon, the most capable subordinate, I think, of all time, and constantly remembered because he was the man who created the Pantheon in Rome, which still stands untarnished in its original glory. And in many ways, he represents that kind of figure as it would be for Rome. I mean, in later Rome, there were fantastically rich senators who did nothing for anyone except sit on their wealth. But the fact is, Agrippa had that kind of capability. And in the sense of what we're looking at today, you could only imagine if, say, and I think I may have mentioned this last week, that Alexander Graham Bell or Thomas Edison had somehow been critical to the choices of a president. Or there's always the instance of J.P. Morgan, who literally saved the United States in the 1890s and was arguably more powerful than the then extremely weak, incredible, shrinking president known as Benjamin Harrison. J.P. Morgan stood head and shoulders above.
Yes, and give him credit for 1907. He saved Teddy Roosevelt and the Federal Reserve.
Well, there we are. I mean, the fact is that he is a man of tremendous utility
Yeah.
to the Trump administration, but can he be effectively, and I won't say harnessed because he can't be harnessed, but can he be, guided into effectively complementing and reinforcing the administration, or will he become a kind of loose cannon, to use that cliche, that creates issues? And of course, Blue right now is hell bent on trying to make the latter the new reality, but I don't think that will happen. And the fact is, however, he has such great strength, and you really can't compare him to Edison or Bell in the sense that although they were fabulously important in creating the structure of American life, um, they had not achieved the level of influence and power. No one in the late 19th century, an age of robber barons, none of them even came close to that. Even Rockefeller didn't really come as close, and they stayed in their lane. They were industrialists, inventors, tremendously powerful men, but they weren't woven into politics. And that's why I come back to Agrippa, because you have a man who has such capability to enhance and pursue and realize the agenda of the new emperor, the new president. And therefore he is a precious thing, unexampled and unique even, and because we're having trouble finding relevant analogs to him. And he could be of tremendous service and influence. And because he cannot be president, in many ways, I don't think that's on his horizon anyway. He can potentially, if guided in the right direction, have an extraordinary influence in our national life.
I picture the Colosseum with Musk standing in the middle of it and the crowd yelling, Elon, Elon, Elon. Does the Constitution stand in his way? The Senate is mortal.
He doesn't have the overall. I won't. It isn't gravitas. There is a kind of quality that a leader must have, and he is not. He's not someone to harness the energies of the populares, and Trump has been, and others I suspect will after Mr. Trump. And
After
that
Trump.
has to be the way it is in America. You cannot have.
And does Musk walk away in 28?
Oh, I don't think he'll move in that direction. I mean, there'd have to be a coming apart in America where we would be desperate because he represents something that is, for all of his capabilities and all of the great strengths he brings potentially to a renewal of American life, he is not within the carapace, shall we say, of the democratic system. The leader has to be not only one with the people, but he has to be part of their world. He has to be essentially, he has to arise out of the political firmament. And it's not possible to get an outsider in. And you can see this if you want to look at it from another direction. America had a lot of presidents in the 19th century who were generals, but we've had very few presidents in the 20th century who were generals because there had been a change in American life. And the nature of early America enshrined the general because the generals were men of the people. George Washington, Andrew Jackson, you had Tyler and Harrison and all of the men who were presidents after the Civil War up through McKinley had served as general officers in the war. But that was put aside in the imperial America that emerged in the 20th century. And the only president who was a general was Eisenhower, and there's a reason for that. And I think that it's not a real possibility that a man who is not a part of the current of the river of politics that by definition involves all of the people and a man who is completely embedded in the world of representation of the people can stand in as president.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're on to the theater, but a thought about a movie that's come out recently and you can see on video now. I think it's $20 to watch. Something like that. It goes on for hours. It's called Gladiator 2, and it's a faithful reproduction of the original Gladiator, which occurred in the 20th century and represented 20th century ambitions. These same ambitions don't work in the 21st century, and yet they've reproduced them here. And what do I mean by 20th century ambitions? Hollywood's version of the world is California's version of the world. It's progressive. The word woke didn't exist in the 20th century. Instead, there were politically correct and incorrect things to say. And it's extremely keen on electing heroes, falling in love with leadership, and being inspired. It's attracted to charisma, progressive California politics. And it's one directional. It doesn't have a dialogue. Hence, California today enjoys a supermajority in the legislature, a governor who's obliging, mayors who are all in the same camp. In other words, it's a one-party superstate. That is what you get in Gladiator 2, if I understand the first half of the movie. Why? Because of this understanding that a republic is a good thing. Good God. Germanicus, if we still had the republic with us, well, I don't think I'd be well-to-do whatsoever living in Londinium, because the republic never protected anyone. It was always at war, for heaven's sakes. It messed up that Carthaginian mess for half a century. We never did get rid of him. He got rid of himself, Hannibal. And then he fled back to North Africa, and it took us a while to get him. We did finally. It's the empire we depend upon, the protection of the empire. Does California know that? That a republic is not the best defense from the villainy that surrounds us?
The absolute bare naked truth of the Roman Republic was that it became corrupted as it was successful. And the more successful it was, the more corrupt it became. And by corruption, I mean that the ruling class arrogated the wealth that was coming in from foreign wars to itself and impoverished the small landowner by forcing him to go on endless foreign wars and then possessing his land while he was away, essentially. I mean, it's a much more complex story, but the fact is that that is the deep corruption, and that is the deep corruption that has come to the American Republic. And the American people are becoming enfeoffed, meaning, they're becoming serfs of a kind in the gig economy, and a tiny percentage rules us, just as it was in the late Republican Rome. And it was that made the continuation of the Republic impossible. And add to it a third element, which is that various power centers among the elite, and especially the emergence of big men, led to civil wars. And I find that so clearly the case in America, where you have political figures who seek to become new big men in an endless struggle. And this is not going to work very well. It can be reformed potentially, theoretically, but the fact is the empire was far more successful than the republic, and there is a reason for that. And you have to remember also that the empire, the Roman Empire, was really a revised republic. I mean, the Senate did not go away. The Roman institutions were still governed internally. It was only that there was a leader, and that leader has been there in the United States, getting stronger and stronger with each generation, and the president is effectively now an emperor. So we're on the cusp of being a true imperial system, and the question is, how do we reform the corrupt world we have so that it moves forward into the future more representative of the people and less at the mercy of the very richest Americans. And that really behooves a reform movement led by a leader. It's a very hard realization to come to, but it is true. Politics is owned by these powerful big men. And the big men are really guiding the course of American life. And they are big because they have money. And that isn't the way it's supposed to be. So essentially, you have to look at the Roman Revolution that ended the Republic and led to the Empire as a massive reform, not an end to corruption, but one that rebalanced things. Certainly for Roman citizens. You have to remember that in the empire, the Roman citizens were everything, especially in the first century that we live in. The whole idea of Rome for its citizens was still there, as it had been in the Republic, except now it was more it catered more and met the needs of its citizens better than in the later republic. And the chaos of the later republic itself was unsustainable. And
And
we've seen that chaos in American life in the last decade.
uh, Germanicus, this is 2 weeks in a row in which you've come up with rosy scenarios. In the last 2,000 years, these reform movements you talk about, yes, they repeat themselves and they always fail.
Yes, they do.
And there's
Well, then I would take
a good
a
probability that this one will fail spectacularly, and they'll talk about us in 2,000 years.
okay. That's a good, correct question. And reform movements in America have actually succeeded. There was a powerful progressive movement after the big shift that occurred in the election of 1896. And after McKinley was assassinated, Roosevelt, as a progressive leader, led many reforms in American life, and America kind of righted itself. I think it did so under FDR in the Great Depression, and that continued through until the end of World War II and after.
I'm not going to be difficult.
No, no, no. I'm just saying that there are failures like the coming apart that led to the American Civil War, but there have also been successes. I do not see a an effective reform movement today as something mirroring, say, the progressive movement of the early 20th century. There is a yearning for reform. There's a tremendous a clamor for it, but there is no ideological movement. And as a result, people have turned to the leader, an effective leader, a charismatic leader, a man who has a vision for America as a stand-in for a larger movement, because no larger movement has emerged when it was needed. So yes, it is not, I'm not being optimistic. What I'm saying is this is where we are.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius John Batchelor. We're under the theater after we sacrificed to Augustus, who got it right in creating the empire, where we blossom. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. Singers from Rome. That's who we're going to see. These are pop hits. I'm John Batchelor.